listen, and the best way to do that is to mute ourselves in this context. So again, very happy to have you all here, and really happy to be wrapping up what I think has been an enjoyable, I hope has been an enjoyable series for you all. We've been, as a reminder, looking at this theme of epiphany in the epiphania, the Greek sense of the word, which is manifestation or appearance, a revealing of Christ, or the interruption, or some would say the eruption of God into the world in ways we can see and notice. And particularly, we've been looking at the manifestation of God in specific spaces and places. Amanda, back a few weeks ago now, started us off talking about the way in which epiphany is attached to certain physical spaces and places, making them holy, or perhaps revealing that they have been holy all along. It's just that we haven't been able to see it. And that we think of epiphany in the story of the Magi, looking at the stars, and the stars somehow declaring this holy event of Christ's birth. We think about it in the stable, the place where literally God in Christ has come to dwell. We hear about it in the river at the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan, where the skies open up and the dove descends upon him. And then we hear some years, not this year, but some years, another element of Epiphany season that's brought up is the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus performs his first miracle as a young man, changing water into wine. And so these common places, these physical places where God is revealed, that's what we've been talking about. And we've chosen to explore then, for our own context, how God appears or is revealed in our bodies, in our homes. And today we're going to explore how Christ is revealed in our churches. And when we say that, I mean specifically in our church buildings, actually, not in this sort of cosmic, universal sense of the church and the mystical body of Christ. Like, that's another conversation we're going to have. But we want to talk about actually our buildings and our sacred spaces as they have walls and roofs and stone and brick or what have you. Now, some of you might be thinking that I drew the easiest task of this series, because we've split up each week across the clergy staff. On the one hand, it would seem to be the most obvious week, right? That the church is where God is revealed, because well, it's a church. That's what churches are for. And I'm not left with the task of trying to argue or articulate the holiness of some heretofore secular space or place, like our bodies or our homes. And yet, one of the things I hope we're going to draw out a little bit here is there is a tension about what the role of our physical structures, our physical places of worship should be in our lives of faith. And more, there's a movement in the church that would seek to distance us from our reliance on buildings. And some people would forswear them altogether and say, they're not actually that important to the work of being the church. And for some, the ability for the church to stay semi-functional, at least, in this virtual realm has added to that argument to say that this pandemic is proof that buildings aren't necessary for the Christian community to stay together. And you have that story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well in John, which is often looked to support this fact that the Samaritans, for those who need a little primer, and it's always good, one of their main differences with Jews, and they were not the best of friends, was that there was a different mountain that they thought you should worship God on, sort of a neighboring mountain, and the Jews thought the mountain of Jerusalem was their place where they should be worshiping. So the Samaritan woman at the well with Jesus in John 4 is saying, well, my people say this mountain, your people say that mountain. What mountain is it? Could you clear that up if you're the Son of God and I happen to stumble upon you? And Jesus says to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. So this idea of worshiping the Father in spirit and truth, unattached to specific locations and places. I think that's a very valuable lesson from Jesus, as they all are. I also think that in the Gospel of John, being written at a later point in early Christian and Jewish history, there is going to be this seeking of a need to distance oneself from the regular places of worship. And we'll talk about why that is. And so perhaps there was a motivation to articulate a Christian faith or a faith in Jesus that could be done and performed outside of traditional places of worship or sacred places. And to be sure, buildings can be like millstones around our neck. They can feel like they're dragging us down or keeping us back from mission or ministry because they cost money to run. Very often they're old and they need a lot of money to run and to keep up. They are our biggest assets in terms of real estate holdings, but they often can be our biggest liabilities as well. And in some churches, spending money on them is often seen as gilding the lily when there are more pressing claims upon our Christian faith. And so I think one of the reasons that this question of the purpose and the need for buildings has come up more recently is because as more and more churches face a decline in membership and then in finances, they're forced to make some really hard decisions about what is essential to their function as a church. And this has led sub-churches to a movement away from an overemphasis on the church building to this sense of church as community or of Christ followers, people gathered in spirit or truth, not bound by walls. And to an extent, this recaptures some of the earliest days of Christianity when the early Christians were these small fraternal communities, not necessarily attached to big buildings. And you'll hear people say, Jesus came to start a movement, not a building project, which I understand and I respect. But one of the reasons I think Jesus didn't ask people to build a building was that they already had their building. They had the temple. So remember, Jesus did not come to start a new religion, though one formed in the wake of his appearing. And up until 70 AD, well past his time on earth, the temple, or the second temple in this case, and I'll talk about what that means in a few minutes, was the central place of worship. And I would also add one of the reasons the earliest Christian communities were limited to small house church gatherings was because it was often dangerous to be a Christian, and their worship, their forming of Christian community had to be done in secret because it could run them afoul of the law and lead to, as it did for many, their arrest and execution. So you couldn't build a building and call it a church because doing so would be sort of to call attention to yourself in that way. So I'm betraying my loyalties out front a little bit here in saying that I think church buildings do matter, and I do think that they're important. But I don't think that because I think that God needs a house or that the Spirit can be confined within four walls, or even because I think Jesus wanted us to build them. I think they matter because we need them, not because God needs them. I understand them to be essential tools to aid our relationship with God and in the formation of Christian community. And I say that knowing full well that we have to be hyper vigilant about turning our buildings into idols, things that we worship in and of themselves, and not using them as tools to something greater, to a relationship with God, our following of Jesus Christ. So that's a tension I think that we're gonna talk through and try to draw out here. Because how and why buildings matter is what I want to spend some time with today. And it's important for us to develop a clear conception of what our buildings contribute to our life of faith, because doing so will help us determine how committed we are to keeping them and maintaining them, and why we would want to do that. So that's where I hope we're going to get to today. But I want to start with what I will call a very brief overview. So don't hold me to this as some sort of full story of sacred space through human history. But I just want to go briefly through this idea of sacred space outside of the Judeo-Christian line, and then more specifically within the Jewish and then Christian history in the scriptures. One of the things I think it's important and interesting to note is that historians and archaeologists and anthropologists have traced throughout human histories and civilizations, and that is way pre-biblical, and that is worldwide, is evidence of people in whatever form they were gathering, setting aside a particular space as sacred. Whether it was ancient burial grounds, or a special section of the camp for tribal rituals, or these ornate and elaborate temples, the Greek or Mayan or Egyptian or Hindu or Buddhist temples that date back thousands and thousands of years. Now, often this setting aside of sacred space is done with buildings, but not always. But what is clear is that setting aside some place, putting a place apart from normal activities, seems to be an important part of how we as humans express ourselves. And it is common enough that I would start to say it seems like there's some sort of need of ours to designate places as holy or sacred. Now, moving into sacred space in the Judeo-Christian line, you get this on the large scale and the more minor scale, minute scale. You get, of course, the promise of the promised land, the Holy Land. God promising to Abraham in Genesis that his descendants will have a space of their own, a land of their own, that is going to be where they will dwell, and God will be their God in the midst of them in that space and place. Then Genesis 28, you have Jacob falling asleep at a place he comes to call Bethel. And that's where he has his famous dream of that stairway up to heaven, a portal, a connection between the human and the divine. And he wakes up from this dream that he has, and he says, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. House of God, translated into Hebrew, Bethel. And this is the gate of heaven. And so he puts a stone down there. He tries to mark that place. And he pours some oil on that stone, and he vows to come back and build an altar there in that place. That's chapter 28. In chapter 35, he does just that. So there's an establishment of a holy and sacred location in that sense. You have something similar if you fast forward to Moses, right? You've got that burning bush appearing to him, and the voice from the bush saying, the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And that happens while he is on what's called at that point Mount Horeb, but which later becomes referred to as Mount Sinai, right? That important mountain, that central location, a place he will return to for important events like receiving the Ten Commandments. Now, there are no buildings yet, but there are important places being marked and honored as places to connect with God, physical location. Now, moving forward a little more, within that exodus in the wilderness, that time of wandering where Moses is leading the people from Egypt and then into the promised land eventually, they have a really interesting setup where they basically have this mobile camp that they break down and set up as they go across the wilderness to these different locations. And a major component of that camp is the tabernacle. And for those of you who are part of the Bible in a Year series that we read last year, you'll remember the extensive descriptions and measurements that were laid out for the tabernacle, which was essentially a mobile sanctuary, a tent that you had to break down and put up at each stop. It was a big hassle. So it must have been important to them to have God in the center of their camp, a place that they could come to as a place set apart for worship, for sacred and holy things. So we don't see a permanent structure in the traditional sense, but we do see a defined structure given over to those purposes, starting all the way back in Exodus. Now, fast forward even further to the Israelites have claimed the promised land, they're settling in, and it's time to put down some roots. And Jerusalem has become their central city. And this is the time of King David and then into King Solomon. So David, eventually, now they finally get to build some permanent structures because they're home, or so they think. David gets this huge, big, beautiful palace, and he wants to build a permanent house for God. He says, well, I have a house, God, I should give you a house. It's only right. You've helped us get this far. And it would be then a sign of God's permanent presence with them. Now, as it turns out, it's not for him in the narrative to do that, to build that house. That task falls to his son, Solomon. And he builds God this fabulous temple that will be the center of Jewish worship and life and identity for hundreds of years. So much so important is the temple that the destruction of it will come to signify the fracturing of their entire nation and be an existential threat to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people. And the most notable time that happens is in 586 BC, at the beginning of the Babylonian exile, where they do destroy the temple, and there's this diaspora. They're sent out into the various parts of the world, the known world, and need to sort of maintain their Jewish identity. We don't have time to talk about how important that was to the Jewish people, but just note that as a really important formative period. What does happen, though, is that they are allowed to come back under King Cyrus, and they start to rebuild that temple. And eventually they do. And that's where you get what I said before was the Second Temple. That's why they call this period the Second Temple period. And that runs from about 516 BC all the way to 70 AD. So that spans the time of Jesus. So the temple he knew was the Second Temple. And so when we see Jesus interacting with and relating to the temple in the Gospels, that's the temple he's addressing or participating in. And he has an interesting relationship with the temple, right? He obviously honors it and participates in its life, but it's also the site of some of his most damning words and actions. Now, if you look at them closely, he doesn't seem to be mad at the building per se. I think he's mad at the people who run it, their misuse of it, the corruption it has given birth to, the manipulation and exploitation done by the religious authorities. So when he talks about destroying the temple or he drives those money changers out of the temple, it's actually because he values and wants the temple to be what it was for, which was a holy place for the worship of God for all people. But he does talk in some of the Gospels metaphorically about destroying it and then rebuilding it, but he does that in the sense of talking about his body in the death and resurrection. There's sort of a gloss given to those passages by the Gospel writers. And there is a sense, at least in the people who come after Jesus, that he has inserted himself, or he is in the place as an avenue to God, not dependent on one particular location or set of practices. Now, again, I think there are great theological reasons for this, and I think there's also some important historical context around the fact that at 70 AD, there's a Jewish uprising against the Romans, and as punishment for that uprising, the Romans come in and destroy the temple a second time. And this becomes a deeply formative moment. And again, it's sort of they're scattered throughout, out of Jerusalem, out of the promised land, and they have to kind of claim their identity as Jews, and at this point as early Christians, slowly branching off from Judaism. So I think there's a reason that moving beyond the temple becomes really important. And there is this reason, and that then allows these small, very organic, very localized communities like house churches to start to spring up. And it allows Paul, it gives him the freedom to say, you can have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, even if you've never been to Jerusalem, even if you're a Gentile and not even a Jew. So it starts to open up in what ends up being a really exciting way, but starts to remove the reliance on the temple as the central one location of God's presence for worship and for the various laws and practices that need to take place. Now, this would seem, what I'm laying out, to be an argument against buildings as necessary for authentic Christian community. But again, I'm not arguing that Christ told us to build churches. What I am arguing is that people have had and seem to have a need for sacred spaces set apart from normal life. And so when people did get the chance to build churches, when Christianity is no longer illegal and punishable by death, they do that. Starting in the 3rd century, as Christianity is allowed to come out of the shadows a little bit, buildings start to be dedicated to the purpose of worship and community formation. Buildings we would eventually call churches. And from there, there's now, there's billions throughout the world. Now you might ask, and you might think, and maybe you can tell me when I'm done, is that a betrayal of the faith? Is that a conforming to culture or an ossification of this particular way of Jesus? Is it a straitjacket on the spirit? Are they golden calves being built up all around us to lead us astray? Perhaps. And if you have that view, I'd like to hear it. However, in my more generous moments, again, I like to think of this proliferation of church buildings to be further proof of our human need, not God's need. We needed a place that was set apart, a place that we could call sacred, a place where we could walk in and say, like Jacob, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, the gateway of heaven. We built them because we needed help in following Jesus. And if you think about it, That's true for most everything about the church as it has accrued over the years, not just our buildings. Our doctrines, like the creed, our rituals, our vestments, our music, all came about as aids to help us in our discipleship. And I think I believe our buildings did too. Now for the second half of my presentation, what I want to do is help us ask, what is it that our church buildings give us that is so necessary as we seek to follow Christ? What is so helpful that we would stay so devoted to them, even though, if we're not careful, they do possess the danger of becoming obstacles or idols, not avenues to our relationship with God? Why are they helpful? Why do we need them? Why do I hear from people so often in these days saying, I just miss being in the space. I just miss being there. What is it that they miss? Exactly. So there's an ephemeral quality to these decidedly unfemoral creations of church buildings. And it's hard to quantify, but I'm going to try to offer some of my reflections on what I think our church buildings give us, and then open it up to you to hear some of the things that maybe I've missed, or you may also feel are important aspects of what our church buildings give us as followers of Jesus. So the first thing they give us is a place to gather. And that's sort of very practical. But I think we've learned anew in this pandemic just how much our flourishing as human beings is dependent on connecting with other people. And it's helpful to have a place to do that, a place that is designated to the bringing of people together. And being a human, let alone being a Christian, is at its core a communal enterprise. It's not a solitary endeavor. So in trying to encourage the communal aspect of discipleship, it helps to have a place designated for that purpose, a place where we can practice being a community. It also helps, I think, to have a common space. And by that, I mean common in the sense that it is open to all and is owned, in a sense, by all, that all can participate there. And I think that's more important now than ever. I had a professor at Harvard, Michael Sandel, and I say I had a professor. I took one of his courses. It had hundreds of people in it. He doesn't know my name. I know his. But not in that course, but at another interview I heard him give as a part of a dinner or something. He was talking about what has now become a more, his project of late, which is this idea of the common good. And he lamented in that conversation that I heard this fact that we have let success, or our glorification of what it means to be successful, become commingled with how isolated one can be. How successful I am is measured in how free I can be, how distant I can be from other human beings. Think about it. How high the gate is in front of your huge private mansion. How you have a private pool and don't need to use a public pool. How you have a private car with perhaps a driver. You have a private plane. You could have a helicopter. This idea, this glorification of superficial success, saying, I could, if I wanted to, get in my helicopter on my lawn, fly to my office, get out, go into my office, fly back home. I never even have to touch the ground that other people walk on, let alone take a bus or a train or sit in traffic and have to deal with other human beings. I have a private island to vacation on. I don't even have to fly commercial airplanes and sit with other human beings. We've lost this desire of a true common space, which leads to a loss, in his argument, and I would agree, to a sense of the common good. Because you lose this idea that other people exist and have needs and wants and desires, and that those needs and wants and desires actually have a claim on you. And so I think we're in danger of losing truly common spaces. We're lucky to have a beautiful public library here in Chapel Hill. Those are fewer and far between. Our public pools are not exactly public. We have more and more the construction of communities that are gated. And there are reasons for those things. But I do think something is lost along the way. And I think for a church, one of the gifts that it offers is that regardless of who you are, this mixed bag of folks standing shoulder to shoulder together at the altar of God is a vision of the kingdom. The fact that you could have a homeless person and a millionaire standing in the same space and place is actually a gift. And I think to have a space devoted to that is important. A space where everyone is of equal value, no higher or no lower, because everyone is of supreme value in God's eyes. That to me, I think, is a really important gift. And one I think we would be bad. It would be a tragedy if we were to lose it. I also think the church becomes a place to escape, a place that is different in that sense, not to ignore the problems of the world, but a place that is committed to ideas and practices that are in a lot of ways countercultural. It's a place to slow down rather than to be busy. It's a place of peace rather than conflict, usually, we hope. A place where less activity is actually better. It's a place to think or to pray, a place to learn, a place to be vulnerable and open. It's a safe space, or we work hard to make it as such. And it's a space in that sense that gives you some freedom from the world. I remember the stories that I've heard of Francis Collins, right now much in the news as director of the National Institute of Health. Stories of him when he was working at UNC, walking by and stopping in our chapel to pray on his way home. And it just so happens he's a man of deep faith. But he had that space that he could access, that he could participate in as freedom from the claims of the world that were upon him, and to remind him or to reground him in the true values and the true source of his wisdom and strength. So not all places of escape are churches. There's lots of places one can escape and have that feeling and feel that freedom. But I do believe that all churches should be places of safety and escape, of sanctuary in that more traditional sense. I also think churches become a place that is collective in our ownership of it. Through our participation in this location, in the life of this place, it becomes a place that we are invested in, that our lives are invested in, and therefore that we care about. We have made memories or friendships, we have cried or laughed or been moved. We've had those ephemeral emotions and really thin places in our lives, and those survive best by being attached to something physical, because it takes them out of our minds and our heads and our hearts and makes them real and manifest. It testifies to their truth. I think that's really important. And I think for a lot of us, that's what we're missing and lamenting right now, that place where such and such happened, or I remember the time that this and I was here. And those moments are the moments and memories that make up our life. And truly, and especially those places those times that were important in our life, are especially meaningful. So as a place to gather, it's more than just a physical place to gather. It becomes a common space, a sanctuary for us and for others, and it becomes our space, our place. Not in an exclusive sense, but in a very commonly owned sense. I also think it becomes, or a church should be and can be, a place of transcendence, a place for the opportunity of transcendence, the possibility of it. And that happens very often with things like beauty, the wonder that we get, the awe that we get with music and art, or the painting or the stained glass or sculpture, and just the architecture itself can help with that. I hope you've had the experience in your life of walking into a church and just having your breath just taken away. Vice versa, I also have a friend who cares very deeply about sacred spaces, and he's very quick to point out places. He says, oh, I can't pray in that church. I just can't feel it. I think aesthetics matter in our experience of the divine, and they matter in how they open us up to the holy. And if you think about it, the artistic act is an act of creation, right? And so God, as the creator, is an artist. So to get caught up in the beauty of a creation is to revel in the wonders of that creative spirit that stir the heart and soul. Again, be it the music or the architecture or the artwork. I'm thinking back a couple of years ago now, or I guess, a little over a year and a half now, to the fire in Notre Dame, right? This beautiful, stunning piece of architecture, of art, of music. and the mourning and the lament for what was being lost in that all-consuming flame. So much history, yes, but so much beauty was being just charred up. So many acts of creation being destroyed. As far as my own personal relationship with it, I remember taking a family trip to France when I was a boy. And before going, my parents insisting that we read a book about Notre Dame, a children's sort of introduction to the church, but also in how it was constructed. And I don't remember a lot of the details, but I do remember this one fact, which I thought was just, it boggled my mind at that point, and still does. That it took so long to build that the people who started it would never see it completed. And so these laborers who were laying the stones or carving the gargoyles or whatever it may be, or getting ready to sort of paint this, to put the stained glass in there, were never going to see the full creation. And so their act of creation, their artistic act, was simply an offering, not for recognition or satisfaction. It was for the fulfillment of having made a piece or a part of this grand thing. And I think also about those tiny details in churches that are so far up in the rafters or so high up you would never see them. No one would ever see them because they're too high or too small or what have you. But they're done because of the need to express this creative spirit that is in so many of us. And they're done essentially as an offering to God. That sense of beauty and devotion, I think, permeates our buildings and can. And in that sense, they become these places of transcendence, transcendent beauty. They also, as I'm starting to allude to here, transcend time, not eternity, but they're not infinite, but our buildings very often are older than us. And this is an important aspect of our ecclesiology, our understanding of the church. Because if we believe in a lower C Catholic church, that is Catholic in the universal sense, that means it's important that that church exists and has existed throughout time and space, that it's bigger than us. So it matters to a degree that our places outlast us, that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves, that our lives are caught up in a place where other lives were caught up in God. It mattered to them, and it matters to us. And hopefully it will matter to other people as we move forward. So honoring a sacred space is a way of honoring those people, both before and to come. And to be reminded of the fact that we are a part of something that is not just our own little reality. So I would ask us, how much of a hold do the people who valued a space before us have on us? What is our responsibility to those who came before and to those who are yet to come? It's not just about us when we're thinking about our church buildings. And I think that adds power and weight to what happens there. One of the most powerful weddings that I've ever been to and taken part in was for my best friend who was living over in England, and he's marrying an English woman, and they wanted to have their wedding out in the countryside. And they found a beautiful estate or manor that they could have the reception in and people could stay in. It was quaint as could be. But they wanted to get married in a church. And in England, what that means is you have to be a participant in the life of that church. So they committed in a very good way of taking the train from London out to the countryside multiple times in the lead up to their wedding to be a part of this particular community, St. Mary's in North Lee. If you've heard of it, bravo. But it's this tiny church, stone, small, little graveyard around the outside, this sort of prototypical English church. And inside, it's very simple. It's not particularly fabulous. But they do have one piece of artwork that is left from all the way like the 11th century or something. It's like 1,000 years ago. They have this mural. The mural's not that amazing. It's a little bit strange. It's not a beautiful masterpiece of art. But when we were doing that wedding, and I got to preach and offer a prayer and things like that, it was palpable how we were in a space, in a place, not just the 50 or 100 people that were gathered, but surrounded by those thousands of people over thousands of years who had come to that place for weddings, for funerals, for regular worship, whatever it may have you. And all of a sudden it became something much bigger than just what was happening in that moment. And we were tied up with this approaching sense of eternity, this elongated sense of time, such that we could have, since for me at least, and I think for others that were there as well, a sense of weight and power and import to what was happening there. So buildings reframe our sense of time, and they bring to mind for us this interplay of the eternal and the temporal, which is so important for our Christian faith, the infinite and the present. It is like a portal to another dimension in that sense, a folding together of God's time and our time, like a time warp, I guess. And I'm reminded in this of T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding, right? The last of his four quartets, which is more or less a meditation on that time warp, spurred by his own visit to a small country chapel of an old Anglican religious community called Little Gidding. And he writes in that poem, he goes, "Here, this chapel, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always." Right? He's talking about how this place is a intersection of timeless moments. And for him, that becomes a really important aspect of the power of the hold that this place has on him. So these places exist and outlast us. But another component of what I think I'm also saying here is that what they have done, what has been done in these places, makes these buildings matter. That we have filled these places with meaning. Eliot, again, from the same poem, he says, "You are here in that chapel to kneel where prayer has been valid." And you may have heard me say before a phrase like this, that when you walk in, the air is thick with prayer, or the walls have been built with our petitions, or something like that. This is a place where people have wrestled with things that matter in the ultimate sense, questions of existence, of life, of death, of celebration, of mourning, of purpose, of direction, of pain, of loss, a place of deep feeling, of questing after truth. In that sense, they're what we might call a serious place, not in the sort of dour sense, but in a sort of import and weight. And I take that word from another poem, if you'll forgive me, by Philip Larkin, the poem called Church Going. And those who tuned in months ago when I led us into this idea of love dwells here through our sort of retreat for a couple of hours, you have heard this poem in full. But I want to take the last stanza, because he's stopping by an old country church. So it's not just big, beautiful cathedrals that can be calling to mind timeless moments. And he's wondering, why do these still exist? Why do I still feel drawn to these places? And ultimately, he says this: "A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much can never be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round." Larkin is speaking to that, to what I'm speaking to. This sense of what we do in these places has made them places of import. And something about ourselves that's called into those deep places of things that matter will be drawn to those places that are devoted to things that matter, if only that so many dead lie round. Now, I will admit there is a bit of a circular logic here, that we have treated these places as important. We have poured our hearts and souls into them, and then that is what makes them important. That we choose to make a place sacred, and then we make it sacred by how we behave in it. So that's what makes it a sacred place. Now, the truth is, I think just because it's circular logic doesn't mean it's sort of no value. I think that is true. But the truth is that Chapel of the Cross, or most other churches that aren't sort of shrines, are not built on notably special plots of earth. We have made this plot of earth, this building, matter because we needed a place to place our deepest parts of ourselves. And so we have. In our little corner of the kingdom, that is 304 East Franklin Street, 2 wonderful structures to do that in. But there are countless others. There's like the National Cathedral, right? A serious, glorious place made all the more serious and glorious and meaningful because of what has taken place there over time. A place that has become an important place to mark important occasions for our nation, for example. We need a place, a space to do that. And the more we do that, the more we are drawn into those places as a chance to exercise those parts of ourselves. And I think ultimately the reason we need that is because what we have helped construct through our own outpouring of soul is that what is said and done in this place makes it a place that is pregnant with the possibility of God's presence. If we believe that the Spirit is living and active and true, and that where 2 or 3 are gathered, Christ is present, if in the acts of taking and breaking and blessing and sharing, Christ becomes a reality, if we believe that in prayer we draw close to God and God to us, and if we value that others have found their way to God in this place, then by nature of its function, a church is a possible, not the only, but a possible stairway to heaven. A meeting place of the human and divine realities. That's what it aspires to be. And so I would posit that the building then becomes sacramental. Sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace or presence of God. That's how we define a sacrament in the church. And that, I think, is what a church building is. A church can be a dwelling place for God, not the only dwelling place for God, but a place where Christ is made manifest. That may seem obvious, but if it's true, then I think we should never forget it. Because if the church building is a sacramental place, it becomes a symbolic place, and symbols really matter. We use symbols all the time. The church depends on them, right? Bread and wine and water and oil and fire. We just don't tend to think of places or buildings as symbols. But a place can be a symbol of something more than just itself, a symbol of an idea or a reality beyond just its physical structure. And I don't think we have to look very far for a really close example of that. January 6th, we have this riot, this storming of the Capitol building, right? And there was destruction of glass and property. There were people whose lives were ended. But one of the things you kept hearing was that this was an assault, not just on a beautiful structure, but an assault on democracy itself, right? This idea. Using the logic I'm putting forth here, the Capitol is a sacramental symbol of democracy because of what has taken place in it for so long. And to storm it, to destroy it, to rush it with violent intent is to assault not just the physical space, but this idea of democracy. So churches are an incarnate physical witness to our belief that God is real and present with us. It's sort of like a big billboard to the rest of the world that says, God exists. So, and it's not just a billboard or a witness to the secular world, it's also a reminder to us. And perhaps one of the reasons we get so tripped up by how we relate to our buildings is that they are the biggest, clearest, most literal manifestations of the reality of God that we profess to believe in. And our commitment to them tests our commitment to that fact that God is living and active and real in our world, that belief. If we're kind of on the fence about that, then I can see how it would be very silly to spend so much money on maintaining them. But as a testament, as a witness, as a revelation to God's presence in the world, I mean, one could say, how could you ever spend enough? If a church building is a sacrament in the sense I define, then it's worth asking if we treat it with the same reverence and care, not idolatry, but reverence, with things like consecrated hosts or holy water. other sacramental symbols that we depend on to aid us in our life of faith. Now, just a word before we get into discussion. As with all sacraments, we have to be careful not to mistake the signpost for the destination, the symbol for what is to be symbolized. We are tempted to make too much of it. And our buildings can become idols if we're not careful. The same way we can fetishize the Eucharist or other sacramental elements of the church and fall in not just to idolatry, but to a certain level of superstition. It's a magical thinking. And our natural temptation to the sins of self-aggrandizement and self-glorification, which we struggle with in all aspects of our life, are particularly triggered by big and beautiful things like buildings. And when that happens, the church can become an idol. The church building can become an idol or an obstacle or an albatross when we become the object of our own worship. And that tension is real and vital because tension actually emerges from balance. And the way to protect us against idolizing our buildings is always to be asking, to what end? How will it help us as individuals and as a community in knowing God, in following Jesus Christ, in living out the works of the Holy Spirit? And if it is meant for that purpose, how do we keep it maintained for mission and for ministry? To a certain extent, there's a question of whether Christians can have nice things, right? And that depends, again, on to what end? To our own glorification and satisfaction? Probably not. But as tools to bring about the kingdom of God, as offerings to the work and worship of Christ, well, then we could talk. So if what I've outlined is true, how we value our buildings becomes reflective of how we value our relationship with God, calling us out of ourselves, but also nurturing us in ourselves. And in a way, you could look at, as one of my priest friends says, building problems are theological problems because they help exhibit for us an understanding of not just God's reality, but the way in which we respond to God's presence in our lives. So what is the right way to care for our sacred spaces? It is that balance between mission and management, because buildings, like people, have needs. And you will be hearing in the next few weeks and over the coming year of some of the needs of our building, particularly our worship spaces. Some capital projects tending to some very, very deferred maintenance. And there will be a chance for us to show our commitment to our church buildings. Now, I bet you didn't think this was going to be the longest, most esoteric sales pitch in the history of humankind. But as we go about that work, it will be important to be asking ourselves how these works help us achieve our purpose as a church. And I think they do. Because we have to keep in mind all those many gifts and tools a well-maintained, functional church building can give to us and through us to the world. So we have some chances to put this into practice. And with that in mind, I want to open it up for a few minutes of discussion and questions from you all about whether I'm full of it, whether what did I miss about church buildings? You could disagree, you could agree. There could be things that I have left out, things that I think I should be considering. But for us to have a little bit of a conversation about this so that we might be able to share our own thoughts on these matters. I'd love to hear from you for a little while. And Boykin, if you'd bring us back into just regular mode so we can see most of the faces on the screen here.
So everybody, you're in regular mode now, but you're going to need to click on your speaker view up in your right-hand corner to get your checkerboard.
And we've got 2 pages worth of people, which is great news. But if you want to speak, just throw yourself into the mix, and you can do it verbally, and then we'll hope not to be talking too much all over each other. I saw Catherine Vaughn's hand. Catherine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, just a quick comment. My first job out of college was as a stewardess with Pan Am that both gave me travel opportunities on the job and off. And something that was hugely meaningful was that, in a way, there was a horizontal Christianity geographically. I could drop in to a service in the Anglican Church in India, Hong Kong, or any place. Maybe the clergy was barefoot. They'd adapted the liturgy somewhat, but it was the same familiar liturgy. And up on the walls would be little plaques. Thank you for the blessing of XYZ, or the tombs scattered around. And then sort of the vertical, in the sense of throughout history, because some of the spaces would be 1,000 years old. You go to Winchester Cathedral and you go, oh my God, quite literally. So that, I think, does bring back to your point of having this designated spot, but it imparts meaning to the person who walks into it.
Yeah.
Even if I'm not part of that congregation, I'm part. My identity gets attached to that spot.
That's nice. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Your identity, and you can bring your identity because there's something familiar in it that there's a commonality that you can pull out in places and spaces that are entirely not not common to what you usually experience. And I think that's wonderful. Thank you, Catherine.
Really hugely, I would say, life-changing in terms of my faith.
Wonderful.
A very subtle but powerful thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. Anyone else want to jump in and offer a comment? Paul Ashdown, I see your hand.
Yeah, Noah, what do you make of mega churches? A building the size of a Walmart that really tries to exaggerate its secular function.
Yeah, and they tend to look secular too, right? Those are some of those places. I will tell you one story. I was very proud, but in a very shameful way, when there's a mega church nearby that, for reasons I won't get into, my boys were going to visit because they had a great playground. And they went to meet, this is before the pandemic, they went to meet someone there who went to that church. And they said, oh, why don't I show you the church while we're here? And they walked inside, and my 5-year-old said, where's the church? Because it was just a big auditorium. Now, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on that tradition. I know I'm playing to the home crowd here, but there is a sense that I think it shows some of what you value and how you understand that for those places, there is this big focus on the pastor. It becomes this, you're caught up in something larger than yourself because there's a lot of people there. It becomes really invigorating because they have technology and modern abilities that very old churches do not. But that sense of being in a space that has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, may not be of particular import to you, or that may not pull upon your theological principles the same way being a part of a church that tries to be Catholic in that universal sense really does. So I think our buildings, like our worship, tend to exhibit those things that we think are important. And so if it's my own personal salvation communicated through a very charismatic leader, and that I get really music that gets my blood pumping, and I also, in a lot of those mega churches, get really small, connected with small groups and sort of really localized communities, that could work. The idea of beautiful architecture or historic spaces and places may not have as much of a weight. And that's why I think there's different styles to this whole thing. There's more than the 32 flavors to this Christian project. But Paul, that's a great idea. Others, yeah, Mark Biggers and then Sarah.
Yeah, for me, the churches I've been involved with pretty much are most meaningful in the sense of intentional gathering and intentional community, and of course that includes communion. But in the worship service and adult classes or Sunday school classes, and like in the case of a Lutheran or Moravian church. But so the buildings mean a lot less to me. I think they're a point of reference for, gee, Christian people or Jewish people go there, or whatever. And I hope it's welcoming to those folks
Yeah.
who aren't church. If I think that's a big concern right now is does our beautiful architecture or our place of worship welcoming to folks. Maybe that means we need more signage, we need something, maybe more publicity. So in that sense, I'm more concerned about, and that's what I think we're all missing, is being able to gather intentionally and have intentional community, get to say hello to everyone, and then get involved in all the activities in the building. So that's ultimately what matters to me. And also the cost of the buildings gets to be, especially when you have a historical church, that really gets to be a problem. So we have to face up to that in some ways, whatever it takes. Maybe we're not sharing our space enough with other worship communities. Maybe that's something we ought to think about. But that's
you're exactly right, Mark. I think you're right. The intent of this place is to form Christian disciples and Christian community, and that is why it is built and why it was built. And that also means that the building has needs that we need to attend to, and we need to be really attentive to when that's in or out of balance with the stated intention of the building itself. If it eliminates our ability to do the things it was made to do, then we need to really look at how we've either have cared for or how we sort of treat our buildings, such that we have to be in balance in that tension rather than completely out of whack, in my mind, one way or another. So I really, you're calling right into the heart of it, Mark. So thank you. Sarah, yes?
I think we have to acknowledge too that church buildings have historically been centers of both political, social, and religious change. And sometimes it's been quite violent change. And sometimes it's been positive change with violence surrounding it. I'm thinking of the changes that occurred to many beautiful churches in Northern Europe after the Reformation, when they went through and destroyed all the windows and stripped all the art, and because they decided they had a different way they wanted to worship. And so there was a great deal of a loss, I think, that went along with that. And to me, that hurts my heart, when something beautiful like that, and it was zealous and it was ugly in some cases, when those buildings were stripped of their beautiful art. But also, if you think of our own American history, there were great meetings in the Southern Black churches during the Civil Rights era. That was where they came together. There was such a strong sense of their church community and their church leaders being such a strong part of that whole process, that I didn't really sense that this summer. And I think that maybe was part of the problem, why some of the message got lost, maybe with within the violence that occurred. Not saying that there wasn't a reason for the upheaval and what have you, but I didn't sense that the church was as strong a presence as it was during the Civil Rights era.
That's an interesting point, Sarah. Thank you for that. And I think that sort of is a testament to the more secular age that we're in than perhaps even 50 years ago, and to the way in which churches can be, when they're really functioning well, those places of freedom, like I said, that like you can come there and be free. So when it comes to one's freedom outside the church walls, it would almost make sense to start inside there, which is because that's the place that feeling of freedom and value and worth, which is good. Linda, I see your hand there.
I just wanted to say, in some ways, it's not the building in terms of the brick and mortar or the stones, that it's the space. And when you talk to architects, they're designing for the space both in and without. They're not really necessarily, and actually architecture is called frozen music.
Oh, I've not heard that phrase. That's wonderful.
And so it's also our experience of the space within and also the space without.
Hmm.
So, and the other part, given your theatrical background, is there is this, it's both a liminal space, but it's also a staging, a presentation, theatrical space. And, they used to have medieval plays in churches. I mean, that was the religious play so anyway, that's my.
Oh, Linda, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. I love that. Frozen music. It does. I mean, it's one of those things you often, even if it's not a big church, there's this way in which you walk in and somehow things seem bigger. Like there's that sort of like almost like Alice in Wonderland, but the opposite kind of thing, where like you step through the door and all of a sudden, because the space is articulated in the way that it is, you sort of have this sense of being transported into this larger thing, which can happen with music, right? All of a sudden it takes you and lifts you to a place or a plane that you were not currently existing on. So that's lovely, Linda. I think that's really nice. It's a wonderful way to think about it.
Yeah.
I see Eileen, and then I'm scrolling through my screens. If there are other people, let me know. And then Heather and Barb, and then we'll
Okay.
wrap up.
What I was thinking when you were talking about the building of the medieval cathedrals, Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, when I was in New York, we used to call it Cathedral of St. John the Unfinished. Because, and then one of the bishops of New York, and I can't remember which one, decided to restart it, and he had to import stonemasons from Europe, and it became kind of a project for local youth to gain skills. They came over and they opened up the stone yards again. They taught local kids from basically the East Harlem, upper Manhattan communities, a trade which they used when they graduated. They became apprentices, and it was still going on. And I still remember there was that awful fire. I don't remember. It's probably 20 years ago, and certainly not as bad as the one at Notre Dame, but there was a lot of destruction.
Yeah.
That went on there. So St. John's is still as far as I know, St. John the Unfinished. And
They're working on it.
Will be.
If
They're
you
working
dig-
on it. Yeah,
They're probably hitting you up for money. They've been hitting up for years and years. It becomes a major part of it.
that's right.
Heather and then Barb Ashdown.
Well, I was just thinking back to what you said earlier, Noah, about, taking your kids to this one church because they had a great playground, and that, gave them the opportunity to have this friend welcome them into the actual church. And I think about all the other ways that our church is used, not just as a place of worship, but, as a polling place and hosting the preschool, which is secular. And Boykin was telling us earlier last week about some other thing that's going on in the Great Hall. And it also reminded me, I don't know if you saw in the New York Times this week, that gorgeous picture of Salisbury Cathedral, which is being used as a vaccination site.
Yes,
with,
yes.
To organ recitals, in the background. But, I think that's a huge part of what we are as a church when we do have the space to welcome so many people into it for all different reasons. And I think it serves two purposes. One, in bringing people in who might say, think about going to Salisbury Cathedral for your vaccination and being absolutely overwhelmingly awed by the glory of that space. You might think, wow, maybe there is something to this Christianity, but also I think it's part of living out our Christian faith in offering that space, whether or not you're trying to bring those people into the church or, to Christ. You're still living your Christian values by saying what we have is yours.
That's wonderful, Heather. I think that's a really wonderful point. And it is an opportunity, right? That if we have these spaces that we're proud of, we can get creative and thoughtful and intentional and faithful in the way that we deploy them. I think that's huge. Barb and then Al Gukas.
When I think about the Chapel of the Cross, and this has been, I've been in the church 3 years now, it really truly represents the communion of saints to me. And we've been through the history of the church, and actually as a member of the Daughter of the King, I had the opportunity to do research about the church and and with the plantation history, and to find out that our church was very involved in plantation history in this area. But we also have had Polly Murray here, the Reverend Polly Murray, the first Black Episcopal, female Black Episcopal priest, preach here. So the communion of saints in relationship to the history of this whole region and area, and the interracial things that have been going on, but also have experienced the communion of saints with the interment of my brother's ashes in the garden. and it makes it full circle.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful, Barb. And I do think that question of sort of what claim do those who have come before us have on us as the current stewards of this space and place is not a light one. It's not just a theoretical exercise. I think there are souls that live sort of on our grounds and in our spaces and places, and to care for them is to care for the spaces and places is to care for those souls in a way. Al Gukas, go ahead.
I'm not very practical about churches. I just think creativity is at the core of human existence, all the way from cave people. And it goes all the way across all humankind.
Yeah.
When I'm in a church and see that creativity used to enhance spiritual life, it just kind of uplifts me. And Mary and I kid, but we were at a church in Switzerland several years ago, and as I walked in, the women's choir was practicing. And I thought at that moment, if this is the end of my life, this is fine. And I think that the beauty of a church is very important.
Yeah.
It can't take precedence over everything else, but it is a key to me.
Wonderful, Al. Thank you. I got a note in the chat to also say to Heather's point about the way in which we're using our building that Club Nova, who many of you know, which is a great organization working with adults with developmental and other disabilities, is going to be using our kitchen for cooking their meals. While their particular space, another one of our partners, the IFC, has moved into a beautiful new space. The place that they vacated is going to become a headquarters for Club Nova, which is great, but they need to do some work to it to turn it over. And so while they're doing that, the cooks from Club Nova who produce meals for these adults with mental illness or developmental disabilities are going to be using our particular kitchen, which is a wonderful kitchen, virtually restaurant grade. And so we're happy to be able, again, offer that to the community, particularly community partnerships that align with our ministry and that we have the relationship with. So again, it's not, these things are not mutually exclusive. The sort of the caring for space and the caring for people are not mutually exclusive things. Thank you for that. Was there anyone else that I missed here that wanted to make a comment before I close us? Yes, Frank.
Yeah, I would pick up on a couple of the threads that I'm hearing and just make the point that, well, I think the church, our church, is doing a terrific job in many, many areas of outreach and providing places within. This doesn't just happen. It needs to be worked at on a regular, continuing basis. Somebody mentioned upstate, I think Eileen mentioned upstate New York. I was very active in an Episcopal church, a historic Episcopal church where we worried a lot about the roof and the boiler. And we provided space for various activities within the church. But in reflection, I have to say that our outreach in any other way than just space or cash donations really suffered. And I think that, it's a culture that needs to be continually nourished. I think we do a good job. Could we do better? Possibly. But in any event, it's not a static, it's not as the stone on the building.
Yeah, that's a great point. A great way to say it, Frank. And sort of constantly need to reassess and reevaluate sort of how are we in balance? Are we in line with how we want to be? as a community? I think those are the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves continually as we go through this whole thing. Well, just to close, I want to thank you all for those of you who've been through this month of sessions where we've been talking about Epiphany and this revelation of Christ. I think, I hope that you've found an ability to notice and see God and Christ at work in your body and your house and your church, even possibly, hopefully. And would just continue to remind us that it's worth reflecting on and articulating continually how it is that God dwells in our church and what our church buildings then are for. And I will say one thing that is absolutely 100% clear in my mind is that I can't wait to get you all back here into this church building and have you here together so that we can go about that work of being a Christian community in the flesh again, deeply from my heart of hearts. That is my hope and my prayer. I want to close us. We took the title for this session from the hymn, you might have known, How Lovely is Thy Dwelling Place, which is a paraphrase of Psalm 84. Now, quick plug, Psalm 84 is the psalm set for Candlemas, which happens this Tuesday evening, February 2nd at 7 p.m. We've got a service that will be streaming for you all if you'd like to participate in that. And before I close, just to reiterate some important dates within our common life that will help us to reflect theologically and practically on our buildings and our finances and the state of our community. The budget presentation next week, February 7th, during this hour. And then the week after that, February 14th, our annual gathering, reimagined for the virtual time. We'll be able to sort of talk about some of the work we have done as a parish this last year and look forward to what is going on. We'll talk about leadership changes and such, but very important dates for you to circle on your calendar to continue to be a part of the life of this parish. But if you'll join me in a closing prayer of sorts, hymn 517. I'm not going to sing it. How lovely is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me. My thirsty soul desires and longs within thy courts to be. My very heart and flesh cry out, O living God, for thee. Beside thine altars, gracious Lord, the swallows find a nest. How happy they who dwell with thee and praise thee without rest. And happy they whose hearts are set upon the pilgrim's quest. They who go through the desert vale will find it filled with springs, and they shall climb from height to height till Zion's temple rings, with praise to thee in glory throned, Lord God, great King of kings. One day within thy courts excels 1,000 spent away. How happy they who keep thy laws, nor from thy precepts stray. For thou shalt surely bless all those who live the words they pray. Bless you all in this time. Know that you are in our prayers, and we are working hard and praying hard for those days where we can be able to gather in our spaces together again. But in the meantime, stay safe, get your shot if you can, and take care of yourselves so that we can be together soon. Okay, my friends? So blessings to you all. Thanks for your